Okay, I'm going to talk about mind reading the market to come up with the next big thing. So perhaps unlike Stephen, I am interested in the 2-year product. But I'm going to give you a good reason why you shouldn't totally focus on the incremental. Now, a number of years ago, I was chassis systems director for an automotive company called TRW. And I remember when doing that, you're trying to design chassis systems, so car dynamics control or anti-lock braking systems, suspension systems or whatever, and you're trying to get some feedback from your marketing department. Those are the fluffy people out on the golf course in their suits or whatever, and they give you very insightful feedback like, the customers don't like that, it feels funny. And you're trying to work out, now what does that mean in terms of the stiffness of the suspension or more modulation on the ABS or whatever. It's a big gap between marketing and R&D in a lot of companies. And I remember thinking back then, if only we could mind read customers, just kind of cut to the chase and work out what it is that they want, because it always seems so expensive to go through the whole process, put the finished product into their hands, only to find out that they didn't like it. Now, we can't really mind read customers, but we can use our scientific skills to do experiments on them and actually bring that down to some very hard points that we can get around customers so we can make the right trade-off decisions and so on and come out with great products. But it's, wherever you look, innovation is a very, very hard business process. Maybe one of the worst performing of all the business processes. All the various gurus around new product development, most patents aren't used. They're just sitting there costing a lot in prosecution fees and so on. Only 3 out of 5 product introductions actually work. Success rate of new innovations is only 25%. And basically, they're all saying the same thing. It's very hard to make it work. And I don't want to dwell on this, but lots and lots of famous flops that illustrate this. Remember the C5 or the Betamax or New Coke or whatever. Great sort of ideas behind it, but in the end, the market gave it the thumbs down. And I think with the new flavor of Coke, it cost them something like $10 million in the first quarter when they introduced that. And they introduced it because blind tests showed that Pepsi, people preferred the flavor of Pepsi, and by changing it, it kind of accepted that, and they lost a lot in the process. So why do innovation? Let's if it's so dodgy, the performance of it, let's do it. Well, I always like looking at the typewriter industry. There have been lots of different generations of technology in typewriters. But the interesting thing about typewriters is the market leaders in every case never survived when the technology changed. The pioneers in this were Remington, the gun company, and the early typewriters were firing pins. And you had 4 banks of these pins, each with a letter on the firing pin, and you would press the buttons and it would kind of pull the triggers back and fire the ink onto the paper. The big drawback with the Remington typewriter was you had to type 4 lines before you could see what you were typing. So lots of customer pain because it was a process that was very prone to making mistakes. Damn, got to type it again. Damn, that's another mistake. And that paved the way for Corona. And they had some, they sort of rejigged it. They changed the layout of the keyboard so that you could actually have the pins and you could actually see the letter that you were typing at the right time. That was an enormous breakthrough. But again, they kind of missed the boat with the IBM and the golf ball, and then all change again with the word processor. So I like the quote, always remember that someone somewhere is making your product obsolete. And yes, you can do the incremental improvement, but you've got to be alive to what the trends are and what other people are doing, because it might actually be a breakthrough somewhere else. So what goes wrong in the innovation process? And this was a survey done of 188 CEOs, and I think it's very interesting. Poor upfront market research was very high, and failure to gather sufficient or relevant end-user input. And I think what's interesting is you've got to make a lot of very hard trade-offs when you engineer a new product. And some of the most profitable things that you can introduce is what you leave out. But you've got to be really confident of your customer input to leave things out. Because after all, human nature says, well, we don't know if the customers want that or that. Well, let's just hedge and we'll put it both in. And what actually happens is nobody likes it then, and you've put your cost up. So it's a very important thing, but the better you can get that user input, the more radical you can be in your invention and coming up with really good solutions. So some of the other problems, you start a new project to develop a new product, the pressure to get going is huge. You guys start coding, well, I'll go and find out what they want. Now, of course, nobody here has ever done that, but it is lots of people. I mean, you think of a car. When you're developing a new car platform, at the height of development, you might have 10,000 people on the program. With the Japanese cycles, it used to take 3 years to do a car. They're getting it down to 18 months. You imagine that poor project manager, new car, and 10,000 people are arriving. And they're saying, well, what do they want? What's about this? What's that? It's terribly easy to be forced into just doing something and getting the teams going. So you need to be actually very rigorous in the way that you do it, and don't just dive in to designing something just because you can't think of anything better to do. It's also very hard to figure out what people actually want. They're fickle. You interview people as to when they go into a supermarket, what's important in when you go shopping, what are you looking for? And they say things like, they try and be virtuous. They say, oh, we like greens, we like all this kind of healthy food. If you then look in their shopping bags afterwards, it's the usual junk or whatever. People aren't straight when you actually ask them. Sometimes we do a customer focus group, and you take a prototype and you take it to customers and see what they think. Now, absolutely fatal is if you make that prototype look too good, because people are polite. They know it's a load of rubbish, but they think, well, you've gone to so much trouble here, we can't tell them that. So they're polite and they say, it's absolutely wonderful, that's great. And that, if you pursued it, could cost you tens of millions of pounds in following a lemon. Often customers, they talk about in terms of solutions. So for instance, before electric razors came along, you talk to people and they can only relate to what's there at the moment. So they'll talk about the bristle on the brush or whatever, and you've dived into a rabbit hole too early, and you've actually closed the door to innovating perhaps new things like an electric razor or a concept that we haven't even thought of yet. Because actually the fundamental job is not about foaming up your face or anything, it's about removing the whiskers from your face. And that opens up the scope for much more innovation than going too narrow too early. The semantics are very confusing. I mean, we confuse ourselves, you know, requirements, needs, wants, solutions, specifications, and so on. Just our own language is very difficult to tease things out. Customers are contradictory, it's incomplete what they give you, and also we are, after all, deep down, very driven by emotions. Any stimulus that we actually conduct is a kind of emotional stimulus, and yes, the logic has to be in step, but you know, it's trying to get that is very important. Making it too complicated, we've already talked about that. Here's a nice little curve. Nice, but I wish it could do more. Oh, that's pretty cool. Gosh, I really like this gadget. Oh, hey, where did they get that in? I can't understand it anymore, and it sucks. So imagine if we could mind read customers. What sort of things would we want to actually understand? We want to understand their priorities. Stephen used the word outcomes. What are the things that people care about in a kind of measurable way, so that we can actually use that as input for designing things? And it's not just logical, it's emotional. We were talking about shavers earlier, and you might actually think, well, we've had an electric shaver, we've had cutthroat, we've had wet shavers, maybe a cream, maybe that would be really good. But it wouldn't pass the test. Would you be happy using that solution in a rugby changing room, for instance? Emotionally, it may be superior in all kinds of ways, but it's not going to be acceptable for all kinds of emotional reasons. We want to know that. It will limit what you do. What constraints, what to leave out. And also, no person will tell you, oh, I want this length of stubble after I've shaved. They won't do that. But they will tell you the length of stubble is important, the shorter the better, and I like all kinds of things about the Braun electric razor, but I'm not very satisfied by the length of stubble afterwards. But I like the cutthroat razor because that gives a very close shave, but it takes too long. Now we've actually can start bounding things. On that dimension of length of stubble, we can actually then go and repeat those and do experiments on it and actually extract those measurables. And this all works not just for products, but also for services. You just do it on the service level agreement, get all the measurables in there. It's exactly the same process. The next thing, afterwards we're going to do a demonstration of these robots. This is a project that we actually did for the MOD. And the job, if you like, that we were focusing on there was gathering intelligence in urban environments. And this job, you know, you can look at it at different levels. We want to identify tactical threats, and that breaks down. We want to monitor vulnerable points, we want to detect threats, we want to collect the intelligence and communicate it to those that need to know. And that breaks down. We need to position the sensor platform, we need to track the threats, we need to compress the signal, we need to pass through our own jammers and things. Now, the scope at which you choose to address the innovation is a big determiner. If you address it at a low level, it's not so disruptive. The higher the scope, the more disruptive the innovation is, the more radical you can actually be. But wherever you choose the job that you're going to address, you then want to collect all this kind of information around it. So the outcomes, so for instance, increase the standoff range. There's no point gathering intelligence if you're compromising the process because you're too close to where you're gathering it, or if it is a threat, you're in the fire zone as a result. You want to minimize the false alarms, and perhaps in percentage. You want to minimize the missed threats. And what's the importance of those different outcomes? The constraints, whatever they could be legal constraints, or in this case, keep to the rules of engagement, emotional, improve security, I want to feel safe. And then competing solutions, human eyeballs, best intelligence gathering system at the moment, unmanned air vehicles, bomb disposal robots, or what have you. So one thing my company, what we do specialize in, is actually trying to get that requirement specification. Try and choose what scope we're going to get the requirements at, and then all the measurements around that, so that if you have a high degree of confidence in that, you can be much more radical in your invention. And we do that several ways. One, we start off an assignment looking at all the macro data in that market, what are the sort of segments and so on, what are the trends. And then micro, we interview people, we observe them, we do ethnographic research, so it's not just down to what they say, we do surveys and things like that. But that sort of results in transcripts, and then you go through with color coding and you say, oh, there's an outcome, there's a job that somebody's trying to do, there's a point of pain where there's unsatisfied with the current solution, and then we translate that into this outcome-based requirement. And then, because like Stephen said, you don't want to address all the pain because you'll never get there. One product can't solve all the ills of the world. So you want to focus on the hotspots where you can actually differentiate. So for instance, the job of identify threats, an important outcome is increase the standoff range. So for instance, for IED inspection or bomb inspection, we hear so much about that in Afghanistan, the metal detector is great, it's reliable. The trouble is, when you find out what it is, you're only 1 or 2 meters away from it. Not quite so reliable is visual inspection, but you can do it at a longer range, but you're still 20 meters away. And the problem is, you really need to be 150 meters away to be safe. So we have an opportunity. You can also look at it from a 2D point of view. So you can take 2 important outcomes, the weight and the standoff range. The weight is important because there are so many IEDs that they're trying to dismantle. They don't have enough specialist resources. So if you can have something portable, then you can deploy the equipment through more people, and people can make decisions earlier as to where to cordon things off and where it's a false alarm. But on a 2D chart, this gives you lots of innovation opportunities. So for instance, low weight, the visual inspection and the metal detectors, high standoff range, the bomb disposal robots. But the interesting thing here is, there's a hole here, and that's the gap that we were addressing with this robot. So something that a platoon could actually carry, and they can put it on their back, and then when they see something suspect at a long distance, they can even strap their metal detectors to it or whatever, they can check this out and gather intelligence. So we're addressing a different part of the landscape to what's actually been addressed before. And I don't know about you, but I'm always interested in looking for these holes where you don't have to compete with everybody. I mean, this is a whole industry of bomb disposal robots, and there's a lot of equipment sort of down there, but this is a white space, if you like, in that chart, and that's always good. Interestingly, we designed this for a particular application, then we actually prototyped it, and then we put it in the hands of soldiers, and then they came up with a whole load of other applications. So although it was for lightweight IED inspection at 150 meter standoff range. They also said, well, could we use it for rebroadcasting? So for instance, if you're in a defensive position and you haven't got a signal, can we stick a radio relay on there and then drive that to high ground so that you get your signal back? Can we put smoke grenades on it and use it, particularly when it's windy, for obscuring troop movement at a much longer range than what you can throw with a smoke grenade? Can we use it for house storming? So throw it in through the window of a house to decide what's the right thing to do. Can you put markers on there, target markers, and just drive it up to a building or whatever that you actually want to destroy? And interestingly, the soldiers also said that they don't get to work this closely with defense companies anymore. It's such a huge, it's like, well, we don't like that. Well, that's going to be 10 million to change that, and they disappear for 2 years. That sort of rapid turnaround where you turn up one week and they say, that's rubbish, or we don't like that, and then you come back the next week and that's all fixed and it's something else, is incredibly motivating for them. I think it's an approach that we've actually lost in this country for actually innovating things really fast. So I think this disconnect between the market and R&D is very harmful. Moving swiftly on. So, okay, you've got this specification now. You've looked inside people's heads, and you now know what it is that they really want. And I think that's the most important thing to get established prior to innovation. So how do we come up with ideas? And this is where I think the more traditional space where a lot of people sort of operate. I like the one, though, particularly in this recession, of what can we leave out. Now we're so certain as to what people want. And I think it's fascinating, the Walkman story, the Sony Walkman. The job that they had for this recorder was to play music to relieve boredom during your daily commute. And the outcomes and constraints that were important, you don't want a big listening range because it will disturb everybody else in the train carriage. You want to create a kind of sense of isolation. You're pressed up against somebody's armpit, and if I can't physically separate myself, at least I can put myself into my own world of music. You want a high sound quality, you want minimum weight, minimum volume, so you can carry it. The solution that Sony came up with, interestingly, they took out the speakers and they took out the recording heads. This was a tape recorder with no recording heads. And they charged $150 for it when they introduced it in 1978. So they charged a very expensive price for something with less components in it, and it took the world by storm. What can you leave out of your products? I think Apple are another company that's very good at this. Understanding what you really care about and taking away all the stuff that gets in the way. Edgecraft. This is another technique I like. I always think, can we build the marketing into the product? Because that, if it sells itself, if you put something in somebody's hand and they feel compelled to go and tell everybody else, you don't need a sales force then. And the way you orchestrate that, you take a product, so for instance, video recorders. Back, sort of 10 years ago, 2-hour tapes or 4-hour tapes. Sometimes it was enough for a film, but you didn't quite get all your program on it. Can you remember those days? And then hard disk recorders came out, notably the TiVo in the States, and you're up at 200 to 400 hours. That was such a gap. You can record a week of television. That was such a gap. In fact, I first came across this product by an American, and he had nothing to do with TiVo. And he came to me and he said, "Have you got one of these TiVos?" I said, "No." And he said, "Just go out and get one. It is brilliant." Just go and buy it. Just take it, my word from it. It is absolutely fantastic. How do you get somebody doing that? Well, you take an outcome that people care about that's not well satisfied by the current competition, and then, not everywhere, but just in these few, and you make such a big change that the market self-references it. People sell to everybody else. Great. Technology push. Okay, we talked about that earlier. And I think, I think there is a scope for people in labs just doing interesting things. However, it's so much more powerful if they've actually understand some market outcomes. So here's an example of working back. This is one of our clients, and they've invented some nanotechnology electrodes for batteries. And they came to us and they said, what can we do with this? So I said, well, instead of working backwards, what does it mean in these sort of outcome dimensions? Well, 28 times energy density of lithium ion, 128,000 charge cycles with no capacity loss. That's interesting. What does that mean? Well, it means you could have a long battery life, you can have a fast charge, you can have a fast discharge. So what does that mean? Well, we could use it for no engine idling. It will start a car engine. We could use it for regenerative braking. We could use it for flash photography in a mobile phone. Or what are the competing solutions? Supercapacitors, flywheels, the Toyota Synergy drive. Or what markets could we actually use it? However, just one word of warning, when you work from the technology back out to the market, you do also need to do your homework on the return path just to check there isn't a simpler alternative solution. That story of NASA inventing pump-action pens for writing in space, whereas the Russian used pencils. Swiping from other industries, the project that Stephen alluded to, we've applied a battle space management system from Kinetic for managing the London Traffic Control Centre in Transport for London. Apparently, it's got a lot in common. Hyde Park Corner with managing battles and things. On these robots, we've taken chassis from defence systems because we knew it had to be cheap, because this will get shot, it will blow up, its average life will be about 3 months, so it better not be too expensive. And then made defence stuff out of that. And then prototyping. I'm a big believer because with chassis systems, for instance, people have difficulty relating to it. So wherever you go, particularly when you go out on a limb or you're radical, just prototype something quickly and check it out with the market. And again, the market will reveal more uses for actually what you can actually use it for. So these robots, within weeks, we had some prototypes going. And we learned tons and tons of stuff from soldiers. That's just a little bit about my company and some of the customers that we've actually worked for coming up with new product concepts with this market-driven approach. Thank you.